Something is happening in Berea, Ohio right now, and if you're only paying attention to the headlines, you are missing the entire story. Not the surface-level story about a quarterback competition, not the clickbait version about Deshaun Watson's contract or draft grades or any of that noise. The real story. The one that's developing rep by rep, film session by film session, inside a building where the people who actually matter, the coaches, the veterans, the offensive linemen who have to block for whoever gets this job, are starting to make up their minds. And what they're deciding is going to reshape the Cleveland Browns for the next decade. The national media is treating this like a side note, like a storyline to check in on once training camp opens and then move on from. But this is not a side note. This is the central story of the entire 2026 NFL season for one of the most historically tortured franchises in professional football. And if you want to understand what's actually happening, you have to go deeper than the press conferences and the depth chart updates and the carefully worded coach speak that tells you nothing. You have to look at what's happening on the ground in Berea. And when you do, one thing becomes very clear. Shedeur Sanders is not waiting for his moment, he's creating it. Let's establish exactly what we're working with here, because the Browns' situation heading into the 2026 season is genuinely unlike anything else happening at the quarterback position across the entire league. 4 quarterbacks, 1 starting job, and a first-year head coach who has made it abundantly clear that he is not handing anything to anybody, regardless of contract size, draft position, or reputation. Todd Monken came over from Baltimore, where he ran one of the most efficient and creative offenses in the NFL, and he walked into that Browns facility with a simple philosophy: the best player plays, full stop. So who are these 4 players? You've got Deshaun Watson, the veteran with the fully guaranteed $230 million contract that became one of the most scrutinized deals in league history before the ink was even dry. Watson was once considered one of the most talented quarterbacks in the game, electric with his legs, dangerous with his arm, a legitimate franchise cornerstone when healthy. But the years since that contract have been defined more by absence than presence. Injuries have kept him off the field for extended stretches, and when he has played, the results have not matched the investment. He's carrying the weight of a narrative that has followed him around like a shadow, and heading into this competition, he was the presumed favorite based largely on experience and the sheer size of that contract rather than anything recent he'd done on a football field. Then you've got Shedeur Sanders, second-year player, 5th-round pick in 2025. The son of Hall of Fame cornerback Deshaun Sanders, which means he came into the league carrying both the advantages and the baggage that come with that last name. He went 3-4 in 7 starts as a rookie, not a world-beating record, but one that came with genuine flashes of something real. Quick release in moments, poise in the pocket, an ability to go through progressions that you don't typically see from a player just finding his footing in the league. He didn't blow anyone away statistically last season, but the people watching him closely every day in practice and in those starts saw enough to believe the trajectory was pointing somewhere meaningful. Behind those 2, you've got Dillon Gabriel, the 3rd-round selection from the 2025 draft class. Gabriel is a capable game manager, someone who can move an offense and avoid catastrophic mistakes, but most evaluators agree his ceiling doesn't reach franchise quarterback territory. He's a quality backup and potentially a reliable bridge option, but this competition isn't really about him. And then there's Talon Green, the 6th-round rookie added this year, who is fighting simply to make the roster and earn a practice squad spot. A long shot by any reasonable measure, but a developmental piece the Browns wanted to get a look at. So when you strip it all down, everybody in Cleveland already knows what this really is: Watson versus Shedeur. Veteran versus youth, the past versus the future. And Todd Monken has said plainly that he would have loved to name a starter already, but simply cannot do it because both players have earned the right to keep competing. That is not nothing. That is a head coach telling you that a 5th-round, second-year quarterback has stood up to a nearly 10-year-long NFL veteran in spring workouts and refused to be pushed aside. And that's where this story starts getting genuinely interesting.
Go back to the start of those organized team activities, the OTAs that kicked off the Browns' off-season program before mandatory minicamp, and the picture was straightforward. Deshaun Watson was the guy. Not officially, not with any announcement or proclamation, but in the way that actually matters inside NFL buildings. He was getting the first-team reps. The coaching staff was trending in his direction. People around the league who follow these things were operating under the assumption that Watson was going to walk into training camp as the starter in all but name, with Shedeur eventually conceding the ground and settling into a backup role, while Watson tried to recapture whatever version of himself existed before everything fell apart. That was the reality, and for a while it held. Reports coming out of the early portion of those OTAs suggested Watson was commanding the offense the way a veteran quarterback with his experience should. He knew the system, he understood what Monken wanted schematically, and he was moving the offense with the kind of efficiency you'd expect from a guy who's been in the league long enough to have seen every coverage and every blitz package imaginable. The momentum was his, the first-team reps were his, and Shedeur was being patient, going through his own work, doing what young quarterbacks do when they're trying to prove themselves in a room that isn't yet theirs. And then something changed. Not slowly, not gradually. Shedeur Sanders made a move, a real one. Not the kind of move that generates a tweet or a graphic on a sports network. A football move. Multiple credible reporters who have eyes inside that Browns facility described what happened in the second half of those OTAs and into mandatory minicamp as a strong late kick from Shedeur, a sustained surge in performance that was impossible to ignore, and critically, impossible to explain away as luck or circumstance. The reps he started earning with the first-team offense were not handed to him as a courtesy. They were not the result of political maneuvering or front office pressure. As one report specifically noted, those were not charity reps and they were not political reps. He played his way into them. And what specifically did he do to play his way into them? That's the part that matters most, because this wasn't about one big throw or one highlight reel moment that gets clipped and posted everywhere. This was about a young quarterback executing the very corrections that his coaching staff had identified as the things holding him back. Todd Monken and his staff had given Shedeur a clear picture of what he needed to do to take that next step. Get the ball out faster, eliminate the negative yardage plays that were killing drives and field position last season, process information more quickly before the snap, and trust those reads after it. Those are not small things. Those are the fundamental mechanics of playing the quarterback position at the highest level, and Shedeur came back from the offseason and started doing all of them at the same time, consistently enough that people inside the building noticed. And when people inside an NFL building notice something, eventually it becomes something that can't be ignored. Here's something that doesn't get discussed enough when people talk about quarterback development at the NFL level. Fixing one thing in a single offseason is considered progress, legitimate, meaningful progress that coaches celebrate and front offices point to when they talk about why they're excited about a young player's future. If a quarterback comes back from year one and his release is half a second faster, that's a win. If he comes back and he's reading the field more efficiently before the snap, that's a win. Individual improvements, even modest ones, are genuinely hard to achieve in the compressed timeline of an NFL offseason when you're also learning a new system under a new coaching staff. Shedeur Sanders came back and fixed multiple things simultaneously. The processing speed improved, the decision-making became sharper, the ball was getting out of his hands faster, cutting down on the sacks and scrambles that are the death of a quarterback's stat line and his offensive line's trust. The command of the huddle, the way he carried himself in those moments between plays when 10 other players are looking at him to set the tone, that improved too. And perhaps most tellingly, according to quarterback coach Mike Bijakian, who works with Shedeur every single day in that facility, what Shedeur was showing wasn't just mechanical improvement, it was football intelligence, operating at a level that genuinely caught his own coach off guard.
Bijakian said flat out that Shedeur blew him away. Not impressed him, not exceeded his expectations in a pleasant way, blew him away. He talked specifically about Shedeur's vision of the field, his ability to see the entire picture before and after the snap in a way that allows him to get to the right decision quickly and with conviction. And then Bijakian said something that really deserves to be heard clearly. He said that Shedeur will say things during practice, observations, reads, adjustments, that initially make Berea do a double take, like he's not sure what Shedeur was seeing in that moment. And then they go back to the film together, and it makes perfect sense every single time. What Shedeur was seeing was exactly right. He was just seeing it faster and more completely than what Berea initially expected. That is not something you teach someone. That is football IQ at a level that is either built into a player or it isn't. You can improve a quarterback's footwork, you can refine his mechanics, you can install a system that plays to his strengths and minimizes his weaknesses, but you cannot manufacture the ability to see a football field the way the best quarterbacks in the world see it. That ability is innate. And the fact that Shedeur's own quarterback coach, a professional who has worked with NFL passers at the highest level, is describing his pupil's vision as something that stops him in his tracks, that tells you something real about what kind of player we might be looking at here. Every team that passed on this kid in those early rounds of last year's draft needs to be paying very close attention to what's happening in Berea right now. Because if this trajectory continues, those draft boards are going to look very different in hindsight. There's a word that keeps coming up when people inside the Cleveland Browns organization talk about Shedeur Sanders. Not a football word, not a statistical term, a word that sounds almost out of place when you first hear it in the context of a quarterback competition. Aura. Now that word gets thrown around so loosely in sports culture, on social media, in barbershops, and comment sections, and it's easy to dismiss it as fluff, easy to roll your eyes and move on to something more concrete. But when that word is being used by veteran players and coaches inside a professional NFL building, it means something very specific, and it doesn't mean what most people think it means. When people who work in football use the word aura to describe a quarterback, they're not talking about charisma or social media presence or the way a guy looks walking into a stadium. They're talking about something functional. They're talking about the way a player's energy changes the atmosphere of a room when he walks in, the way receivers run routes differently when they trust the guy throwing them the ball, the way offensive linemen set protections with more conviction when they believe the quarterback behind them is going to make the right decision, the way a defense that just got scored on feels like it has no answer when a particular player is running the offense. That is what aura means in this context. It means players believe, and when players believe, they perform better, and when they perform better, you win football games. The reports coming out of Berea suggest Shedeur Sanders has that quality, not in a manufactured way, not because of his last name or his father's legacy, but because of the way he carries himself in that building every single day. And the outside confirmation of what's happening inside that locker room came from a source that is hard to dismiss. Robert Griffin III, a former NFL quarterback who understands what it takes to earn the trust of professional players in a locker room because he's lived it, weighed in on this situation without hedging a single word. RG3 said that if he were the decision-maker on this, Shedeur Sanders would be starting when those OTAs opened. But more important than the starting opinion was what he said about the locker room specifically. He said the Cleveland Browns locker room believe they can win with Shedeur Sanders. And then he said the thing that should register as the most significant detail in this entire story. They don't believe that about Deshaun Watson. They don't believe it about Dillon Gabriel either. A former NFL quarterback with relations inside that world, someone who knows what a locker room looks like when players are bought in and what it looks like when they're not, telling you that the people who practice with these quarterbacks every single day have already made up their minds. The receivers running the routes, the offensive linemen setting the protections, the running backs responsible for blitz pickups that could be the difference between a clean throw and a hit that ends a quarterback's season. Those people believe in Shedeur Sanders. RG3 said directly that it's Shedeur's job to lose. When someone with that background and that level of football knowledge speaks that plainly, you don't brush past it.
But as significant as all of that is, there was a moment this offseason that told you more about Shedeur Sanders' mindset than any practice rep or film session could. A reporter asked him about Deshaun Watson's tradition of hosting separate off-season workouts with offensive players down in South Florida. The kind of private sessions where a quarterback gathers his weapons, builds chemistry, and establishes the kind of individual relationships that translate into trust on the field during the season. It's something Watson has done before. It's something a lot of veteran quarterbacks do. And the reporter asked Shedeur directly, would he attend Watson's sessions or would he hold his own workouts separately? Because if he held separate sessions, he would essentially be drawing a line in the sand, creating a camp within a camp, signaling to the guys in that receiver room that there were two teams inside one team. Shedeur's answer was this: if one of us is doing something, we're all going to do it together as a team. He said the quarterback room was connected, that everyone was communicating, that holding separate sessions would create separation, and that separation wasn't something he was interested in building. We're all team. That's what he said. 3 words, and those 3 words communicated something that 1,000 highlight clips couldn't. Because what Shedeur was saying wasn't just about one set of workouts. He was saying that his understanding of what it means to be a quarterback in the NFL goes beyond individual performance. It extends to the environment he creates around him, the culture he's building in that room, and the message he's sending to every player on that roster about what kind of leader he intends to be. That is not a second-year player talking. That is a franchise quarterback talking. None of what's been said so far means Deshaun Watson is done, and anyone telling you the competition is already decided hasn't been paying close enough attention to the full picture. Watson closed mandatory minicamp strong. He has experience that cannot be replicated in an off-season program. Experience playing in hostile road environments, managing full NFL seasons from opening day through late season games where everything is on the line. Reading defensive schemes that have been specifically designed to take him apart. That kind of experience lives in a player's body and mind in ways that don't show up on a practice field when there are no pads and no pass rush and no real consequence for a bad decision. When the pads come on in training camp and real NFL defenders are trying to put him on the ground, Watson's experience becomes a legitimate advantage that Shedeur simply doesn't have yet. Watson also did exactly what a veteran quarterback should do during the offseason. He gathered his guys. He hosted those private workouts in South Florida with several Cleveland receivers. Jerry Jeudy, Isaiah Bond, and Jamari Thrash were among the players who showed up, and he worked on the kind of individual timing and chemistry that separates a functional quarterback-receiver relationship from a truly dangerous one. Those connections matter. A receiver who has run the same route with a quarterback 100 times in private knows exactly where the ball is going to be and exactly when it's going to get there. That kind of anticipatory trust is built through repetition, and Watson was out there putting in that repetition during the weeks when the facility was closed and other players were scattered across the country. So, the honest assessment of where things stand heading into training camp is this: the burden of proof has shifted, but the competition is real. 3 months ago, Watson was the presumed starter, and Shedeur was the one carrying the weight of proving he belonged in the conversation. Based on everything that came out of those OTAs and minicamp, that dynamic has reversed. Shedeur has done enough to make this a genuine fight, which means Watson now has to answer a question rather than simply maintaining a position he already held. He has to show up in training camp and in those first 2 preseason games and demonstrate that when the intensity increases, when there are pads and pass rushers and real defensive coordinators scheming against him, he can command this offense with the same decisiveness and clarity that Shedeur showed in the spring. If he can do that, this is a real competition, and it goes down to the wire. But the dynamic is changed. Watson entered the spring as the favorite. He does not enter training camp holding that same position. Shedeur earned that, and that's not nothing.
Here's what gets lost in the day-to-day coverage of this quarterback competition. And it's the detail that might matter more than anything else when you're trying to evaluate what kind of player Shedeur Sanders really is. He has now done this twice. Twice. He came into the league as a 5th-round pick, which in NFL terms means you walk in the door with approximately 0 organizational leverage and a depth chart position that starts near the bottom. As a rookie, he found himself behind 2 other quarterbacks. He didn't create trauma.
He didn't have his representatives make noise to the media. He didn't sulk or check out or do any of the things that young players with his pedigree and his expectations sometimes do when the situation doesn't immediately conform to what they envisioned. He worked. He waited for his opportunity, and when it came, he went 3-4 in 7 starts and showed enough that people inside that building believed in what they were seeing. Then this offseason arrived, and despite what he'd shown as a rookie, the organization brought in Deshaun Watson, or more accurately, kept Watson around given the contract situation, and once again, Shedeur was the one who had to prove himself. Once again, he was behind on the depth chart. Once again, he was in a building where the presumption was that someone else was going to get the job. And once again, he responded by working his way back up. Not through noise, not through anything external, through performance that was measurable and consistent and impossible to dismiss, even when the people making the decisions might have preferred a simpler path. 2 times, 2 separate occasions where the organization was seemingly trending away from him. 2 separate responses where he said nothing publicly, changed nothing externally, and simply kept working until the work spoke loudly enough to be heard by everyone in that building. That is not coincidence. That is character. And character, when you're talking about the quarterback position in the NFL, is not a soft concept or a feel-good talking point. It is the single most accurate predictor of long-term success at the position, because the quarterback position is the only job in team sports where the adversity is relentless and completely unavoidable. You are going to face games where nothing works. You are going to face seasons where the injury report has your name on it. You are going to face fan bases that turn on you, media narratives that bury you, in moments of failure so public and so complete that lesser players never find their way back from them. The quarterbacks who survive all of that and become the players their franchises build around are not always the ones with the most arm talent or the fastest release time. They're the ones who respond to adversity the way Shedeur Sanders has responded to it every single time it's presented itself in his young career. Quietly, purposefully, by getting better. Everyone is asking the short-term question: who starts Week 1 against the Jacksonville Jaguars? Who gets the first team reps when training camp opens? Who does Todd Monken name as his starter before that first preseason game? Those are legitimate questions, and they matter for fantasy football purposes and for the immediate outlook of the 2026 Cleveland Browns season. But they are not the most important question, not even close. The question that actually determines the future of this franchise, the question that the Cleveland front office, the ownership group, and Todd Monken himself have to be sitting with every single night, is longer than one season. It's longer than one contract cycle. The real question is, who is the quarterback this organization can build around for the next 10 years? Because that question is the one Cleveland has been trying to answer since the franchise returned to the NFL in 1999. Think about that. Think about how long that search has been going on. Think about all the players who were supposed to be the answer, the ones who generated excitements, in hope, and genuine belief before the reality of the situation revealed itself. Tim Couch, Derek Anderson, Brady Quinn, Brandon Weeden, Johnny Manziel, Baker Mayfield, who came closest to actually being that guy before things unraveled, Colt McCoy, Case Keenum, names that represent years of searching, years of disappointment, years of a fan base being asked to invest emotionally in players who ultimately couldn't sustain it.
And then Deshaun Watson, the trade that was supposed to end it all, the fully guaranteed $230 million that was supposed to signal to the rest of the league that Cleveland was serious about finding their franchise cornerstone. And Watson has not been able to stay healthy, has not been able to produce consistently, has not been able to make that contract look anything other than an albatross that the organization is still carrying into yet another offseason of uncertainty. This isn't about blaming Watson for things that were partly beyond his control. Injuries happen, circumstances shift, but the reality is that Watson has not been the answer, and at a certain point the organization has to reckon honestly with that reality, rather than continue investing in a situation that has produced almost no return. Which brings everything back to Shedeur Sanders. 23 years old, fifth-round pick who played his way into first-team reps against a veteran with a decade of NFL experience, a quarterback whose own coach said he gets blown away by the football IQ on display every day in practice, a player who responded to two separate situations where the organization seemed to be moving away from him by working harder and performing better, rather than creating noise or drama. A guy whose locker room already believes in him, whose teammates already trust him, whose presence in that building has apparently already begun to shift the energy in ways that coaches and veterans are describing with a word, aura, that doesn't get used lightly in professional football settings. When you ask the 10-year question instead of the Week 1 question, when you line up all of the evidence that has emerged from this offseason rather than leaning on assumptions built from contract sizes and draft positions, the picture that develops is fairly consistent. Shedeur Sanders is not a project. He is not a backup plan. He is not a developmental piece to stash on the roster while you wait for something better to arrive. He is, based on everything that has come out of Berea this spring, a legitimate franchise quarterback who is competing for a starting job and winning that competition based on merit, on performance, and on the kind of character that coaches point to when they're trying to explain why a player is better than his draft position suggested. Training camp is coming. The pads are going on. Real defenders are going to be trying to disrupt everything Shedeur built in those spring sessions, and that's where this competition will ultimately be decided. Not in a minicamp practice with no contact and no live pass rush, but in the crucible of full-speed, full-contact NFL football, where the only thing that matters is what you do when the pressure is real and the consequences are real, and the whole building is watching to see how you respond. Shedeur Sanders has now responded to adversity twice in his young career, and twice his response has been exactly what you want from the person you're trusting to lead your franchise. If that pattern holds when the intensity of training camp arrives, the Cleveland Browns aren't just going to have their Week 1 starter, they're going to have their answer to a question they've been asking for over 2 decades, and it's going to have come from a fifth-round pick that a lot of people didn't believe in, which, when you think about it, is exactly the kind of story that makes football worth watching. Drop a comment right now. When those pads come on in training camp, does Shedeur hold serve and lock up this job, or does Watson's experience take over when the contact gets real? The debate starts below.